So now we are moving on to chapters 4 and 5, which is market failure in chapter 4 and government failure in chapter 5. So just very briefly, when we talk about market failure, what we're saying is that the market is not behaving in the manner in which society would prefer or the way that society wants it to behave. And that could be the result of failures within that, with the firms involved and so on and so forth. There could be just not doing exactly what it is that we as society want. And the other part, the government failure, these go together, and that is that the government is either it's the aim for addressing markets, government stepping in, and so on and so forth, is to find that optimal point. So if we have suboptimality, we ask government to step in to address some of these problems, some of these issues. And that could be just in just the simplest terms, too much of something or not enough. And so government steps in to address that by either adding to or taking away from. Okay, that's kind of at the kernel of what we're talking about in terms of market failure and government failure. So again, the government failure piece of it has to do with government either doing too much or not enough. And remember, when we talk about markets, the role of government really, when it boils right down to it, should be to enforce competition. So they are there to protect competition and not to protect individual competitors. Okay. Anyway, onward we go. So there are different types of what we term market failure. And the first that we're talking about is, well, in general, we're saying market failure. Markets are not clearing in the manner in which society would like them to clear. They're not behaving in the manner in which society would like them to behave. On the right-hand side, we have a typical demand curve, downward sloping demand curve. And whenever there is a downward sloping demand curve, that indicates what? It indicates market power. There's some degree of market power when we have a downward sloping demand curve. Down below, we have a flat, a horizontal demand curve going straight out. And that is indicative of perfect competition. That is indicative of the way markets would behave ideally for whom? For the consumer, the household as consumer. Anyway, backing up to the typical downward sloping demand curve, what you'll notice is that the marginal revenue, remember the demand curve is also what we term the average revenue curve as well. And the marginal revenue curve is 1/2 the distance between that average revenue curve or demand curve and the axis and the y-axis, if you will, going down. So it bisects, if you will, the space between the demand curve or average revenue curve and the y-axis. So it's half the distance. And that's something to always keep in mind about marginal revenue. So anyway, onward we go. Again, the bottom, the one underneath, is representative of a perfectly competitive market. So first, when we talk about market failure, we say that there's some market power or there's price power, as indicated by the top graph downward sloping demand curve. Now there are different types of what are termed market structures, and we'll be getting to that as we kind of go along. But just to identify a monopoly is one seller. The firm is the market, and the market is the firm. They're one and the same. They are what are called price makers. They are not price takers. So the upper graph again represents, it could be a monopoly, it could be an oligopoly. So the 4 different market segments, if you will. And it's a broad sweep of a spectrum. It goes from perfect competition to what's termed monopolistic competition, and then it's on to oligopoly, and then finally to monopoly. And so this is the representation, if you will, of that market power. And it's a broad sweep going from either end, from perfect competition out to monopoly. At any rate, a monopoly and oligopoly, which is the next one in, monopoly means one firm, and an oligopoly means a handful of firms, so a few firms. And they tend to be they are called price makers. They're not price takers. They can dictate the price. They can dictate prices in the market itself. And in general, whenever we have market power, the price and these are just little indicators, little tricks of the trade, if you will. Again, marginal revenue is 1/2 the distance between the y-axis or the vertical axis, the price axis, and the demand curve or the average revenue curve all the way down. It bisects that space in between the average revenue curve and the y-axis. And what we notice here is that, again, just to note that price is greater than the marginal revenue, because what you don't see here on the lower graph, which is the perfect competition, which is a horizontal demand curve, there's the demand curve, the average revenue curve, and there's also the marginal revenue curve. They all share the same space because it is horizontal. So at any rate, this is just kind of outlining what we talk about in terms of market power and how it has to be addressed. We're identifying what it is, and we'll be moving on. So again, when we talk about monopolies, first off, monopolies, and we'll be talking more about this when we move into market structures. Monopolies are in the U.S. are not legal, okay, in general terms, meaning when you think about it in terms of Standard Oil, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, railroads, Carnegie and Steel, going back into the late 19th century, where all these, where a lot of legislation was passed against breaking up these monopolies. Monopolies are also called trusts, and so this was all the antitrust legislation. At any rate, we do have monopolies that are legal, and those are called natural monopolies, and those are public utilities. They are declared public utilities, and we're used to seeing public utilities, of course, in terms of energy, delivery of energy for the consumer, in terms of like electricity or natural gas, in terms of, for heating purposes. So that's kind of the space out there for public utilities, and there are necessarily very, very high barriers to entry for monopolies and natural monopolies as well. And what that means is that really what it comes down to, just strictly economic terms, it has mostly to do with the cost, the very high cost of gaining entry into that market, into becoming a natural monopoly. And there are a lot of regulations that go along with that as well, from the government side. So the next step down from monopoly, there's a duopoly, so there would be two firms comprise the entire market. But more typically, you go from monopoly to oligopoly. Oligopoly, there are a few sellers. There may or may not be a price leader to enforce market power. And they, again, like the monopolies, are price makers. They are not price takers. They don't just take whatever the market price is, and they can actually have influence over those prices. And the regulatory authorities that are over these, including monopolies, the monopolies have a lot of regulatory authorities, the natural monopolies, that would be at the state level, Public Service Commission, Public Utility Commissions, so on and so forth. Oligopolies also have the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, so that's at the federal level, obviously, and Department of Justice, the Antitrust Division. And again, something to note is that price is greater than marginal revenue, meaning the average revenue or the demand curve is sloping downward to the right. Again, there are very high barriers to entry. Examples are numerous in the U.S. economy. In fact, probably a fairly good portion of the U.S. economy would be comprised of oligopolies. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but percentage-wise, I'm guessing it would be close to 50%, or maybe a bit less, but there's a significant amount of firms that are part of oligopoly. So this all has to do with market failure in terms of market power. That's one. That was the first one. Now onward. Second, we're talking about externalities. And again, what we're saying is that society does not like the way that the markets are behaving. So they ask government to step in, government deeming deeming that determining that there are externalities involved. Meaning, when we say externalities, we're talking about government stepping in and because the market won't do it, the government to step in to internalize those externalities, to bring those externalities in. So it's and we'll get into it's either increased production or decreased production, increased cost, decreased costs through subsidies, tax breaks, etc. So we're asking government to step in to deal with these externalities. So again, when we talk about external benefits, for example, those are called positive. They're also called positive externalities. So external benefits or positive externalities. If the market itself is left alone, the system is left alone, it is not producing enough goods and or services, and or the price is too high. They're pretty much one and the same. There's not enough being produced by the market, and the prices are probably, or it might be too high for the consumers, or higher than society would prefer, which is pretty much everything, but we kind of pick and choose our battles, right? So government steps in to add to production somehow, some way, either through producing it themselves, like in public education, K through 12. That's government produced education and is determined to be a public good, as in goods and services, okay? Not good as in good and bad. So these are public goods. They are being produced by the government, and they can either be produced directly by the government or they can be subsidized in some manner. So K through 12, we have public schools. Those are government schools. At the college level, we have both public and private. The private are subsidized through financial aid, as are public schools as well. So when you think about it, the cost to educate someone, a student, is pretty close to being the same. Okay, the underlying cost, but what the reality is that the public is higher than private for a variety of reasons. But at any rate, so the main difference between the two, public and private, is that the private is more tuition based. So that's why we have tuition being 2, 3, 4 times higher than you would see in a public institution. And the public institution is more driven by tax funding, meaning given direct subsidies, as opposed to on the private side, where there are a lot of subsidies that are derived through financial aid process. And it's not to say there's not financial aid in public, but there's not going to be as high of a bill, for example, for tuition, we'll say. So again, that was external benefits or positive externalities. Not enough being produced, we ask government to step in to add to production. External cost or negative externalities, we say that the market is producing too much, or it might be at too low of a price. It's not capturing that externality. So we ask government to step in again to internalize that. And the way they do that is by imposing fines, I should say first regulating, and then if you're in violation, you get fined, basically, right? So example of that would be there are many, first off, but we'll just stick with our natural monopoly, the public utility producing electricity. So government, through policies and through different boards, again, Public Services Commission, etc. There's a determination that there's an externality present, and again, external benefit, positive, we add production. We're focusing here on external cost. Negative, we went to lower production by adding cost. So in this case, again, the market fails to capture the total true cost of the good or service, and it's not reflected in the market price. So here's our example. And there are different government and regulatory authorities. Again, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, and the list goes on and on at the federal, state, and oftentimes at the local level. So an example, again, was the production of electricity in a coal-fired plant. So we add, by adding regulations, meaning we say, okay, you have to reduce your carbon emissions by 50%, for example. In order to make that happen, of course, there's a lot of cost involved, installing scrubbers and various other equipment to reduce that reduce that smokestack emission, those smokestack emissions, right? And so there's additional cost is added to the process. And remember, the firm answers the question where production occurs, where costs are transferred from the firm to either back to the household in the form of reduced compensation income, or passed forward in the form of higher prices. So typically what would happen is that with something like this, the cost would be passed on more than passed back to the owners of those productive resources. At any rate, the bottom line is that these regulatory costs are passed on in general to the consumer, and as a result of which price goes up. And what does the law of demand dictate? Yep, if price goes up, the quantity demanded is reduced. So this would twofold. One, there's reduction in the actual pollution that's coming out. Secondly, there's less usage. There's reduced usage. There's more conservation, if you will, at least again in theory. So the third form of market failure, the first form of market failure had to do with market power. The second had to do with internalizing externalities, external benefits and external costs. The third has to do with rivalry, non-rival goods rather. So when we say it's, pardon the expressions, welcome to econ land, right? Non-rival goods, when we say non-rival, they are non-rival in terms of consumption, and they're also non-excludable, meaning that you cannot exclude the non-payer from consuming the good or service. So two things. Non-rival goods are non-rival in consumption in terms of you can't, by adding more people to that, it's not going to change the amount that's out there. Example, we have military. So the people who consumes the military, the citizens of the country, right? So if you add another 5 million people to the country, is it going to diminish the amount of military that you're consuming? No, it's not going to change that. That's what they mean by non-rival in consumption. By adding more consumers to the mix, it's not going to reduce the amount that's out there. At any rate, the excludability part comes in that it's not to say you can't exclude people from from accessing or from using or taking advantage of whatever that is. But the problem is that it's very, very difficult and very, very costly. So what we say is that, the examples again, military flood control. Flood control would be, how do you you live beneath the dam. Dam has to be maintained, replaced, what have you. Who agrees that the dam should be maintained and replaced? Everybody that's down below that dam, of course, right? Who's willing to step up and pay for it? No one. It's not to say that you don't want to pay for it, but if you had your choice, you would not pay for it. So this is why we ask government to step in to address these issues when we talk about goods that are non-rival goods and non-excludable goods. Okay, because it's everybody benefits from these, and yet you have a very difficult time excluding people from from participating, non-payers from participating, from using whatever that service or good is. Anyway, you get the idea. So this is what this is termed is called the free rider syndrome or phenomenon or whatnot. And the result of which is you have a suboptimal level of production. Meaning, if you left the military, for example, if it was privatized, a lot of people wouldn't pay for it. That's just plain and simple. And it's not that they hated the military. People understand the need for the military, but nobody wants to pay for it. Similar, again, to this flood control scenario. Here's an even easier one. And I'll let it go at that for now. So anyway, note again that suboptimality can be too little or too much. It can go both ways. Suboptimality, too little, it means, again, like there's an external benefit, and suboptimality the other way is that there's too much, and that would have to do with the negative externalities. All these things flow together if you haven't noticed already. So non-rival goods, or those are private, and then we move on to private goods. Those are like a personal vehicle, your car. It's rival in consumption, it's rival in consumption, and it's excludable. You can't exclude other people. So you have your own private vehicle. You put the miles on the vehicle. So you drive 100,000 miles, and you have the ability to do what? Exclude other people from using that vehicle. So you get to, one, determine who consumes it, and two, you get to determine whether or not you're going to let anybody else, use that vehicle or use that product or whatnot, that good or service. Public goods, again, they're non-rival in consumption. We've already described them. Non-rival in consumption, non-excludable. Public goods, and this is the rationality behind this is that since no one is willing to step up and pay for the military or flood control or anything, there are numerous examples of this. We ask government to step in to do that, and in order for government to step in to provide education, for example, to provide for military or to provide for flood control, government has to pay for it. The government doesn't have money on that by itself. It has to do what? It has to raise taxes, and this drives home that central point that government at its core is given a license to take your income, take a portion of your income. Remember, income goes to three things. Income goes to taxes first, as we're already pointing out. First and foremost, right? Taxes, consumption, and whatever's left over is saving, or could be negative. Point being, again, is that government has the ability to coerce, the ability to reach into your pocket and take some of your income from you. And this is to address the problems that are associated with public goods, this non-rival in consumption and non-excludable phenomenon that occurs. Common goods, so these are three different types. They're private goods, public goods. Common goods, they're rival, meaning that when you go in and you can consume them, there's going to be less after you go in and consume. And it's non-excludable, meaning this is a reference to the tragedy of the commons. The example that I always use is the Grand Banks fishery. It's getting kind of old, but there are others as well. But the Grand Banks fishery, meaning it's in international waters off the coast of Canada, and who has access to international waters? Yep, everybody. Who owns it? Everybody and nobody at the same time, right? So you can go in there and with your gigantic fishing vessels and take out thousands, if not millions of tons of fish. And the result of which, of course, was the Grand Banks fishery was fished out. And so it had to be addressed, but these are common goods. Common goods are, think of it in terms of like a public park at a municipal park. You walk through the public municipal park, and everybody has access. There's no charge, and there tends to be what? More litter and so on and so forth for many municipal parks because everybody has access to it, and there are no controls in place, if you will. The last one would be a quasi-public good. So we said private goods; those are rival and consumable and excludable. Public goods are non-rival and non-excludable. Common goods, the tragedy common, they're rival, meaning they can be consumed, and they're non-excludable. You can't prevent people from consuming them. And quasi-public goods are non-rival in consumption and excludable. So everyone has access to these. But at the same time, you can exclude them from accessing it. Perfect examples would be post office, turnpikes. There's what is the charge for accessing public post office? Of course, you can get in for free. There's nothing about that. But in order to actually utilize their services, you have to pay for postage. Turnpike, anybody, as long as you've got a vehicle, I suppose. I'm not sure what the criteria are exactly. Typically, at least two-wheeled motorized vehicle and you can get on for free, but when you get off, you have to pay. These are quasi-public goods. So again, when we talk about public goods, it's the education, public education, and when we refer to the term public sector versus private sector, these can be confusing at times. The public sector has to do with government workers. So a teacher, for example, in education would be in that public sector. And so that would be on the input mix side. So keep in mind, whenever government steps in to address these externalities, when government steps in to address this, the problem that's associated with non-rival and non-excludable goods, government has to use what? Has to employ resources, productive resources from the household, right? So again, just walking through the public good is the education, the teachers in the public sector, the private good is the automobile, the auto worker is in the private sector. Teachers and auto workers are part of that input mix, the productive resources that are being employed at the firm. So yes, you could say that a college, for example, or a school is a firm. And what is being produced at that firm? We're talking about intellectual capital. We're building our knowledge. We're building our skill sets, right? So this is what's being. It's a capital goods firm, meaning we're producing in schools, or at least should be, developing the talents of those students. At any rate, the output mix side, the goods and services that are being produced, education again on the public sector, and the automobile in the private sector. The various regulatory agencies again are the EPA and the FTC, etc., Department of Justice Antitrust Division. So this is, again, I've got the circular flow here, and so on the input mix side, in the public sector, we're talking about teachers flowing to the public sector firm, if you will. In the private sector, we're talking about auto workers, again, providing their resources to the automobile manufacturing firm. And the output, of course, would be education on the public sector side, and back to the household. And on the private sector side would be the automobile, the aforementioned automobile. So again, in terms of market structures, the aim, when you talk about market structures, moving from monopoly down to through perfect competition, or if you will, moving from perfect competition to what's termed monopolistic competition, to oligopoly, and finally to monopoly. The aim of government in addressing, issues, market failures, and so on and so forth, should be to ensure competition. It should be to protect competition, not individual competitors. So on the micro level, what we're talking about is that we're promoting the concepts of equity and efficiency. We've already briefly talked about both, but equity in short means that the owners of those productive resources, that labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and land, are receiving no more than their opportunity cost level of compensation. No more, no less, right? So that's equity. Equity means that you are being compensated for in a competitive sense for the use of your productive resources. Efficiency is that the maximum, it's maximizing the amount that's actually being produced for the consumer. So you're getting the most bang for your buck, the biggest bang for your buck. You're getting the maximum number of goods and services at the lowest possible price. So this is on the micro side. We'll be talking more about this as we go through. On the macro side, because of this protecting competition, addressing market failures, and so on and so forth, what this should do on the macro level is to maintain or to keep unemployment at lower rates. Should also help in terms of price levels, inflation, tamp down inflation, and finally should also promote economic growth. And so how does it do this in the macro sense? By going as we're going through reinforcing regulatory authorities and so on and so forth. Again, the objective is to do what? Is to protect that competition. And it's through competition, through competitive markets, as competitive as you can make them. It has a tendency to reduce the amount of unemployment, keeps price levels in check. So how does it reduce unemployment? It reduces unemployment because we're using all of our productive resources to the maximum of their capabilities. All right. So we're using them efficiently is really what it comes down to. And so far as inflation is concerned, so long as that invisible hand of competition is in place, that's going to tend to keep prices down, because you're hard pressed as a firm to raise prices if your competition is unwilling to do so, right? So it's very, very difficult. And finally, the economic growth, of course, stems from using all of these resources in a most efficient manner. At any rate, onward. So now we're going to be talking about breaking out the different components, if you will, of what's behind this demand curve. And the first thing what we'll do is we'll just highlight consumer surplus and then producer surplus. So the consumer surplus is the portion. So we have a downward sloping demand curve, sloping downward to the right. And we have a price, and we've got a quantity demand, that relationship. So it's touching, going out to that demand curve at a certain point, at a certain price point, and it's corresponding quantity demand if you drop it down to the x-axis, the quantity axis. So at that point, the portion, this portion of the consumer surplus represents what the consumer would be willing to pay but does not have to pay due to competitive pressures. This again is a consumer surplus. So it's that triangle that is bounded by the price line, the y-axis, and the demand curve. So it's the triangle that results from that portion that's above that price line within the bounds of that demand curve or average revenue curve and the price line. So again, it's the amount that some consumers would be willing to pay, fewer of course, because the prices were higher, but they would be willing to pay, but do not have to, because the price is driven by competition where it's at. And what we notice is, remember when we talk about what revenue is equal to price times quantity. So that's the revenue box down below the consumer surplus, and that represents the revenue flowing through to the firm, right? And remember, the firm answers the question where production occurs, where costs are transferred, and so on and so forth. So the revenue that actually flows to the firm, where does it ultimately end up? Back at the household in the form of compensation to those for the use of those productive resources from the household. Moving to the right, we've already identified the consumer surplus. Again, it's this portion that represents the consumer would be willing to pay but does not have to pay due to the competitive pressures. And that's bounded again by the price line on the bottom, the y-axis or the price axis on the left, and then the demand curve sloping down to where the price point is at. That represents consumer surplus. Now, the producer surplus, if we look at that revenue box from before, and we draw a line up where the supply curve is at, where it crosses that price point, where we reach that equilibrium point, where we have the equilibrium price and we have the equilibrium quantity supplied and the equilibrium quantity demanded. That portion on that supply curve, and it's bounded by the supply curve, the price line, and the y-axis, if you will. That represents the producer surplus. That what that represents is what the producer, the owners of those productive resources, is receiving in excess of its opportunity cost level. So again, this shows the producer surplus, or the economic rent. So these are two terms meaning the same thing: producer surplus or economic rent, paid to the productive resources, either directly to labor or for to the productive resources that own the capital, entrepreneurship, and land. Okay, so that represents the producer surplus, what they're getting in excess of their opportunity cost level of compensation. So the opportunity cost level of compensation is the other portion of that of that revenue box, and so that's bounded again by the supply line, the x-axis out to where the quantity demanded is at, and then the quantity demanded line going up to where the price point is at. So we spend a significant amount of time talking about what? Talking about market power. That's one of the main problems when we're faced with market failure. And that's really what we're focusing in on now, is that market power or price power, meaning that you can dictate price. So what that means is that if you have price power, you can raise prices. It sounds pretty simple, but it's actually what actually occurs is kind of interesting. And what we say is that in order to raise prices, you don't just raise prices, you actually do what? You restrict supply. So in our graph here, it's pretty cluttered, but the idea, for example, is moving from S1 to S2. So by reducing supply, remember, we're moving leftward, we're shifting the supply curve to the left. And as a result of which, what happens is that we move up the demand curve. The demand curve hasn't changed. So we move up the demand curve and that price increases. Remember, with the law of demand, it tells us that as price, if price increases, the quantity demanded is reduced. But remember, as good entrepreneurs, what do we care about? The revenue. That's all we care about, really, when it comes right down to is the revenue. So here's the aim, is that if we're able to reduce supply and still be able to do what? Increase our revenue, then that's what we do. We aim to reduce supply to that point. So here's our example showing consumer surplus and producer surplus in action. Restricting supply with OPEC. OPEC is the oil producing exporting countries. So think about it in terms of like Saudi Arabia and it's pertinent now. Forget about the actual dollars per barrel, because the barrel price is always fluctuating. But at any rate, so again, OPEC restricts the supply of oil in order to do what? To raise prices. And in effect, they're trying to raise prices so that they can increase their revenue. And as a result of which, again, this is market failure when you have price power, when you have market power. So market failure, and you end up with what? The end result is that you're actually reducing the consumer surplus. So in effect, by moving from S1 to S2, this is what happens. Moving from S1 to S2, that's a new price, moving from $50 a barrel up to $70 per barrel for this oil that we're talking about, through restricting supply by moving from S1 to S2. We're also reducing the amount of oil that's being produced from, in this case, 20 million barrels down to 15 million barrels. And that's going to do what? Increase prices. So we're making a massive assumption here, and that is, of course, otherwise we wouldn't do it, by reducing supply, by restricting supply, we're able to actually increase our revenue. So remember, now that's kind of the key point behind this. So we're all about increasing our revenue. So as a result of which, what happens is that first, as we indicated before, the consumer surplus shrinks, the producer surplus expands. It grows by that rectangle that's added to that producer surplus. But we also, so those are the two components, consumer surplus and producer surplus. And the producer surplus does expand. However, what happens is that there is a deadweight loss by moving up this demand curve. By shifting that supply, we end up with what's called the deadweight loss. And so that's taken away from the consumer, one, and it's also taken away from the producer. But the reality is, with our entrepreneur hats on, do we really care? All we care at the end of the day if our producer surplus increases. And clearly from this representation, it does. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing this. Okay, anyway, just walking through, I'll just read through this. In studying this graph, explain what a cartel such as OPEC, the Oil Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, does in order to increase the price of crude oil. Noticing several things. First, note the triangle for the straight line demand curve. Remember, we're keeping this simple because it can get really crazy. With its base as the perpendicular line from the price axis, it's segment AB, okay, moving from A to B. Next, the line segment of the demand curve from where it meets the supply curve up to the price axis, that's BC, moving from point B up to point C. Lastly, we have the price axis down to that equilibrium point, segment CA, moving from C down to A. That represents the consumer surplus. Okay, again, this refers to the consumer surplus where the price is at $50 per barrel. The buyers or consumers in this case expend an amount equal to the price of $50 per barrel times the quantity demanded of 20 million barrels or $1 billion. This is also the total revenue flowing through to the firm. This revenue will then be used to pay all expenses with the remaining revenue called profit in an accounting sense. The triangle we have called the consumer surplus represents an estimate of additional expenditures the consumer would have paid if they had to in order to acquire the equilibrium quantity of 20 million barrels. In our example, the original consumer surplus is 135 to 50, 135 minus 50, or 85 times 20 million barrels, or $1.7 billion. Okay. So some of the potential revenue represented by the consumer surplus could be expropriated or taken, if you will, by the firm using a technique called price discrimination. A simpler tactic would be reducing, this is the main focus here, by reducing the supply and driving up the price to everyone. If the firm is unable to do so, the consumer surplus stays with the consumer. Note again, in this example, OPEC raised the price from $50 a barrel for crude oil to $70 a barrel of crude oil by reducing supply from S1 to S2. So the consumer surplus would shrink significantly. The consumers would pay more, receive less, right? Law of demand. The loss of the consumer surplus is equal to the increase in the producer surplus of 70 minus 50, or $20 times 15 million barrels, or 300 million plus the deadweight loss of 1/2 of the $20 times 5 million barrels, or $50 million. The total loss of consumer surplus would equal the sum of the two, the deadweight loss and the portion from the deadweight loss, and also the portion from what's added to the producer surplus, and totaling $350 million. There are further implications of deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is neither the consumer nor the producer receives this portion of the former consumer surplus. The result is a loss of surplus value. So 2 examples showing the consumer surplus, producer surplus in action. Expanding supply. So it can go both ways. Keep this in mind. Expanding supply and growing this consumer surplus. So we're going to be moving, in this case, from S2 back to S1. So again, we should we desire to see the effect of increased competition, assuming a major new oil field came into production or something along those lines, thus increase in supply of oil, again moving from S2 back to S1. And so we reduce the direction of the changes. The producer surplus would decrease, and the deadweight loss in this case would go to 0. The consumer surplus would increase by the sum of the decrease in the producer surplus plus the decrease in the deadweight loss. This has, of course, income distribution implications because remember, the firm is simply the place where production occurs, where costs are transferred. So in this case, the income distribution relates to the rewards, again, paid by the firm back to the household for the use of its productive resources. Always keep this in mind. You ask this question, how many of us are consumers? We are all consumers, all right? Again, everyone is a consumer. Not everyone is using their productive resources, or does each of the productive resources possess the same quality or quantity of resources? Meaning, some people are there would be some people that would benefit from a higher price of oil if you're working for the oil company, for example, while others, I mean, everyone is a consumer, and they would be harmed by this, including the people who have to buy gasoline as well, that work at the oil company, if you will. So, anyways, the extent of the economic rent or producer surplus rewards in excess of opportunity costs is shifted back to the consumer surplus, depending upon the degree of competitive pressures in the market. So the idea is that the larger the consumer surplus, the better off the consumer is, plain and simple, right? So when we talk about the different types of failure, we break them up into two categories. One would be demand side failure, and that would be, in this case, we want to move from, in our graph here, we want to expand, shift our demand curve to the right, shift it rightward, moving from D2 to D1. And this is all the things that are, so we have government step in to internalize that benefit by adding more education, by increasing demand. So remember, that's shifting demand from D2 out to D1. This is, so demand side failure is actually the opposite. Shifting from D1 to D2. So that's failed. The market is not where we're not producing as much as we really ought to, or the items are priced too high, plain and simple. So again, we do this by altering both the input and the output mix. The input mix in terms of hiring teachers, and the output mix in terms of increasing the amount of education that's being produced. So where the demand side failure was that we were addressing demand by increasing demand, increasing the amount of production, reducing the price, what have you. The government stepping into that. Supply side failure has to do again with the supply. And what we are in effect doing is that we are asking government to step in to shift supply from S1 to S2 to reduce supply. We're asking, in a sense, it sounds like we're asking government to do damage to the markets by doing that, trying to reduce the amount of supply. But the reality is that we see that with supply side failure, in terms of like pollution not being internalized, the electricity that's being produced is not capturing all the cost of that pollution, meaning that in order to capture that pollution in the market price, the price has to be higher, because of the cost of what? Because of the cost of those scrubbers, because of the cost of moving to cleaner resources, and moving from dirty coal to a cleaner coal, or from coal to natural gas, etc. Right? So again, the supply side failure, we're shifting inward, moving closer to the y-axis, shifting from S1 to S2. So again, it's priced too low and is not being internalized. So it's not being addressed. It's not embedded in that market price. So we ask government to step in to address that, and government, by shifting the supply from S1 to S2, is going to either increase prices and or just simply speaking, reduce supply, as indicated in our graphic here. Okay, so we have demand side failure, supply side failure. The Great Depression, this went from roughly 1929 through October 29 through, people argue differently, 1939, 1940. Some people say even after the end of World War II. The reason being is that during World War II, all the production, there was a lot of it, everything was ramped back up, but all the production was geared toward defense, not toward consumers. So there's kind of an argument against that, meaning again that, at any rate, the Great Depression, the reasons for it, and there are a lot that are out there, and I'll just very, very briefly touch upon when we talk about demand side failure, and in this case being reinforced by that supply side failure. So the demand side failure occurred moving from D1 to D2 because the economy collapsed, right, in the Great Depression. Everyone knows that. So what happens if say you're an auto company, you're Ford Motor Company, and you're building cars, and your demand suddenly collapses. But you continue to build cars for a while, right? Until you realize, oh, we shouldn't be building as many cars. This is for real. This really is a collapse. So you end up with excess inventory. So as a result of having excess inventory, how do we clear inventories? How do we clear surpluses? Sales, reduce price, right? Rather than reduce price, what many firms did, including Ford, including the auto companies, rather than reduce price, they restricted supply. They pulled supply back. So you had a double whammy confounding effect so far as the economy was concerned, because you had that initial collapse in demand, followed up by this supply side failure as well, where that was, we're trying to maintain prices, trying to maintain profit margins and what have you. And as a result of which, maybe we'll just say Ford went from producing 1 million cars a year to producing 500,000 cars per year. So if you're producing 500,000 cars per year rather than 1 million, do you need as many people working? No, massive layoffs. So you see where this cascade of problems kind of occurred during the Great Depression. There are other things that occur as well, but that's just kind of bringing the two of these together, this demand side failure and supply side failure. So typically when you hear finance, you equate that with economics, but in particular when we talk about public finance, that is definitely the realm of economics. And what happened in 1959, there was Richard Musgrave. He was he had fled from Germany prior to the Second World War, and settled in the U.S. At any rate, so he wrote a book called The Theory of Public Finance in 1959, and he focused on we'll throw 4 areas in here. So he talked about resource allocation, the role of government, rather. What is the role of government? Resource allocation, addressing suboptimalities, altering that input and/or output mix. So addressing those issues that are associated with what? With externalities, and also we're having government step in to address those externalities, how they go about doing it, through the taxation process and so on and so forth. And so you see that if government sees that there's identifies a problem and is asked to kind of step in, right? They do step in, and in order to do so, they have to spend. And when government spends, they're addressing it in terms of both the input mix and the output mix. I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but the idea is that they're altering that input or the output mix. So this is the resource allocation. Government steps in to reallocate or reallocate how the resources are actually being employed, if you will, and to what end? What is it we want to produce? The second has to do with stabilization. Remember, this is the role of government. In general, we're saying we want full employment, low unemployment. We want price levels that are low as well. So we want low inflation kept at bay. And there's some discussion perhaps about deflation as well. But at any rate, you get the idea, is that we're talking about trying to keep price levels down, keep them within the right framework. And lastly, government taxes and expenditures to combat recession or inflation. So to keep the economy on an even keel, to keep the economy growing in a manner in which it would like it to grow. So that's when we talk about stabilization. The third piece has to do with the redistribution of income, and that's the rationale behind income taxes. So in order to fund the government's needs so far as like addressing those externalities and so on and so forth, the people have to be taxed. And the redistribution of income comes into play, especially in the U.S., at the federal level at the very least, when we're talking about a graduated income tax or increased marginal rates, however you want to characterize it. So those taxes are taken out to pay for addressing those external costs and so on and so forth. Also, something to note about transfer payments. So government is trying to redistribute income, trying to level things out to move them more toward the equal, equal income distribution. And that's where the transfer payments come in. Transfer payments would include anything from Social Security to welfare payments to Medicare to Medicaid, so on and so forth. These transfer payments that are flowing through to the citizens, to the people in the country, irrespective of whether or not they actually contributed to that or not. So anyway, that's the redistribution of income. And the last thing I have on here is economic growth. And economic growth is kind of embedded in the stabilization piece. But again, economic growth, the government is out there to encourage, to increase economic growth, to protect competition but not competitors. So who bears the burden of government intervention? The taxpayers, of course, do, right? That's the burden. The burden is the cost that would be flowing through the taxpayers. And the taxpayers are the household, again. The private sector, there's a cost benefit associated with that, meaning that if you're going to be moving more teachers into the mix in the public sector side, you're going to be removing them necessarily from the private sector side. So there is a cost associated with this to the private sector. The private sector is reduced. Size of private sector is reduced because of the space out there, the public sector, the folks that are out there in the public sector. So there we say that the cost benefit associated, of course, with that is that there's a cost, but we're saying that it's worth it in terms of the benefit that we get from that. Is that true? That's for society to determine, I suppose. Lastly, real quickly on moral hazard. Moral hazard has to do with the insurance principle, and basically it comes down to is if it's something that you can avoid from occurring, then that defies that insurance principle, or more, it also defines that moral hazard. Okay, so moral hazard again would be an example of which would be you are driving on the freeway and the speed limit is 70 miles an hour and you're driving 120 miles an hour. That's a moral hazard. That's in defiance or in violation of that insurance principle. So this is again, these are you're not avoiding things that can and should be avoided is really what it comes down to. So again, when we talk about government failure, these tend to go hand in hand. Market failure, government failure. So the reason for government involvement in addressing market failure has to do with what? Addressing the market power, concerns over market power, concerns over externalities, external positive externalities, negative externalities. We want government to step in to do more with the positive and to reduce the amount that's actually being produced, for example, in addressing pollution, trying to reduce the amount of pollution that's out there for that negative externality. And lastly, it would be for public goods. Is government going to step in to do what? Subsidize, as is the case with education at the at the college level for farmers, subsidizing farmers. Let's stick with the education piece. Subsidizing that public good, which is education, or actually producing it at the K through 12 level with public schools. Okay. So, example in 2021, I should update these, but at any rate, government's overall impact footprint, if you will. So when we ask government to step in, their coercion methodology or the way that they fund the mission for themselves is, of course, through taxes. And taxes are coercive. We don't volunteer to pay taxes. So all taxes at the local, state, and federal level amounted to about $6.7 trillion in 2021. National income amounted to about $20 trillion, $19.9 trillion. Taxes amounted to about 34% of that national income. Note overall expenditures, so we collected $6.7 trillion in taxes, but we spent far more than that, to the tune of $9.2 trillion. The expenditures amounted to about 46% of national income. So we, of course, were running deficits at the time. So again, to reiterate, when we talk about demand side failure and supply side failure, demand side failure has to do with the free rider principle. When we talk about flood control, fireworks, if there's an external benefit that's involved, we want to alter the input and the output mix. So as a result of which, what we're doing is we're asking government to step in to move the shift demand from D2 out to D1, to expand demand, right? As opposed to supply side failure, we're saying that the item, the good itself, is priced too low. And it's not internalizing, it's not showing up in the final price of whatever it is that's out there. So we're asking government to internalize that cost, to bring it back into that market price, right? And so as a result of which, think about it in terms of the law of demand. If the price is higher, the quantity demanded is reduced. That's the law of demand, straightforward, right? So in this case, what happens is that by adding cost, if you will, to the production of energy and production of electricity in this case, what happens in essence is that the supply is restricted, moving from S1 to S2. We ask government to do this, to restrict the supply. Externalities are present and must be internalized. This is the role of government. This is the reason for being for government. If there's an external, whether we're talking about external benefits, where we're asking government to step in to add to production, or if we're talking about external cost, where we're asking government to step in to add more cost or reduce production. The market forces are equal to the product mixes. Ultimately, we're saying that the product mix that results because of market forces is less than optimal or suboptimal. And when we're talking about stabilization, this was a driver behind John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes was the economist, British economist, that was trying to ask government to step in to address the external benefit that resulted from the collapse in the market during the Great Depression. So again, Keynes was again a British economist, and what happened was he was looking at that market failure that presented itself in terms of what amounted to an external benefit, meaning the government. He was a great proponent for government stepping in to pick up the slack, if you will, from that fall off in demand that we described earlier. And what he was saying is the government could do this in order to do what? To help move us away from this recession, to get us out of this recession that was the Great Depression. So in general, what we've seen is that there's a tendency, or there's a bias toward recession and inflation, or there has been, when we have market power present. So we asked government to step in. So he was a big proponent of that, government to step in to address those recessionary gaps in this case. It could also with inflationary gaps. So this market power, when market power is present, there's this dual bias, if you will, toward recessions and also inflation. So it's a double whammy, if you will. The recession would be coming from that fall off in demand and the desire for firms to maintain prices, and the inflation, of course, would come from the ability to raise prices, the prices going up. So really, at the end of the day, when we talk about inflation, rising prices, we have to ask ourselves, where does that occur? It occurs at the firm, and the firms are able to raise prices more readily when there's less competition. It's really what it comes down to. Market power is an indicator of less competition, or an offshoot of less competition. So rather than lower prices, the clear market firms with market power tend to reduce supply to protect profits when competition is insufficient. Competition itself pushes the economy toward that self-regulation, reducing recessionary and inflationary biases. Inflation again comes from firms raising prices. Recessions can occur when the firms are unable to adjust price levels. We have sticky prices is the expression. Reduce prices, you're unable to reduce prices to eliminate those surpluses. The more competition, really, at the end of the day, the less the need for government involvement. And therefore, there's less of a reason for government to be coercing as much in terms of collecting taxes as much. Not to say that there's no room for government, but there's certainly, if you have competitive markets and they're able to adjust accordingly to clear these markets, so we don't have as much in terms of market power because due to competitive pressures, then this is absolutely ideal. It shrinks the size of government, not the role of government. It shrinks the size of government so that they don't have to be as involved in many of these things. So our politicians are the ones that determine how these externalities, if there are externalities, how they're going to be addressed, and if they're successful, then good things can happen. With the power of government stepping in to address such things as perhaps like education or reducing pollution and so on and so forth. They can successfully intervene in those processes. If they are successful, then we move back toward a more optimal level. We have more education and also we have better education as a result. Whether or not that's the case, that's debatable. Is it worthwhile reducing pollution to the point where we have zero emissions? It becomes very, very costly, and there are different ways of analyzing that. But this is where the political end of this comes into play. So again, the downside with politics, in the government side, is that the invisible hand does not work in the public sector because there's no competition. Or I should say there's less competition. There might be some, but typically not much competition when we're talking about, and in terms of government services being delivered. Layered government, when we've got all these different layers of government, the federal, state, and local levels that are doing basically the same functions, that becomes again more costly. You could certainly identify this as government failure. And it's also very, very difficult to fire politicians. So large numbers, I guess I've heard 60+% of voting jurisdictions are safe for one party or the other. In our, Democrat versus Republican elections, basically in the U.S., there are two parties, and you're pretty safe. Once you're in, you're pretty safe. Unless you're in a very contentious area, highly contentious area where it switches back and forth all the time. You're pretty safe so long as you don't kill too many people. Anyway, I shouldn't say those things, but the idea is that also with politicians, see if this rings true, and this is again government failure, is you overpromise and underdeliver. What is it that you want? Yes, I will try to get that for you. I will try to make that happen. The reality is that you make promises that either you can't keep or you have no intention of keeping. And this is quite common in government, and it certainly is just one indication or one more indication of government failure. Public choice was something that was put together by an economist, James Buchanan, not the president. James Buchanan, in essence, distilling it down to one thing, there's a lot more to this, and that is that the politician's number one goal is to be reelected. Straightforward as you can get. The problem that occurs, and this is not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector, is this principal-agent issue or problem. In the private sector, you have the principal being the owner, the stockholder, and the agent being the entrepreneur, or the CEO, or the board of directors. In the public sector, you have the voter and the agent. The principal would be voter, and the agent would be the politician. Their aims do not always coincide. In fact, they rarely do, to be totally honest with you. Politician will say anything and to get elected, and once they're elected, they're going to do their darndest to be reelected, and the desires of the electorate, the voters, is oftentimes secondary, right? It's similar in the private sector. Um, the stockholders have control in terms of being able to dictate. They vote with their ownership, or selling or buying more shares of stock. But the entrepreneur, the CEO, for example, has different aims altogether. Oftentimes, they don't always necessarily coincide. That's why there's this principal agent problem that's mentioned here. That especially when we're talking about government, it's another failure in government. Rent seeking, another name for lobbying. So an example would be the regulating the internet. Um, the CAFE with the corporate average fuel economy standards. What I mean by that is that with the rent-seeking piece of this is that, I guess to be more specific, when you have lobbying groups, people that want things to get done, like regulating the internet. Who wants the internet regulated? Well, if it has to be regulated, you would like to control how it's regulated so that it benefits you the most. So if you're Google or Facebook or Amazon, or I shouldn't say Amazon, but you get the idea. Google, Facebook, etc., Instagram, so on and so forth, Twitter, and the names keep popping up. But if it is going to be regulated, then you want to be able to control as much of that regulation as possible to make it as beneficial as possible to you. That's rent seeking or lobbying. CAFE fuel standards, that would be the auto companies getting together and trying to dictate the terms of what those fuel standards, those fuel economy standards might be. You get the idea. They're trying to drive the legislation to their benefit. They're rent seeking. They're trying to get something out of this. So clear benefits, hidden cost. What that means is that a politician, example, Big Dig in Boston. It's basically, Boston is a very congested old city, and the idea was that, hey, if we dig a tunnel under downtown, we would be able to bypass Boston, going from east to west, north to south, or whatever. And by doing so, we will be able to cut hours out of commute times, or increase, decrease consumption of fuel, and so on, the hours that are spent on the road, and commute by commuters. And so it was a great idea, and it was initially, I think it was going to be about $5 billion, the original estimate. It ended up costing $24 billion. Never be able to get the money back for this, because of course what they were going to be doing is charging tolls, and they probably do, but would never be able to recoup that $24 billion. Similarly, in California and in San Francisco, the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, it ended up costing $6.4 billion and took 11 years. The original construction took a couple years. And the original estimate was it was something on the order of $200, $300 million. So this is clear benefits. Yes, we want this done. The hidden cost is that we forgot to tell you that it's not going to cost X amount. It's going to be X plus something amount. Okay. So further on government failure, and really what you can do is you can look at the size, the footprint of government, and how big government should be, how big does it really have to be, so on and so forth. But the reality is, again, back to when we talk about overpromise and underdeliver, this is the space of politicians, and it's really quite amazing when you start looking at digging down into these numbers. And this is another indication of government failure: unfunded liabilities. So Social Security, we'll start with these numbers on the left. 20.5 trillion. Medicare again is for seniors, people 65 years and older, receiving health care through government programs, government insurance, I should say. And as opposed to Medicaid is for low-income families and so on and so forth. State and local pensions, 4.6. These are all trillions of dollars, right? Anyway, so this is this Truth in Accounting organization, as it's called. They've went through and did the accounting on these, and what they found was that in general, when we're talking about outstanding liabilities, unfunded liabilities, just real quick, fast facts, if you will, on this. So according to truthinaccounting.org, which noted that there's $96.3 trillion owed and promised, but unfunded by Medicare and Social Security benefits. $55.1 trillion for Medicare, $41.2 trillion for Social Security. There are a number of others as well that are out there. But at any rate, the takeaway is that there are promises that are made. I shouldn't say promises. There are expectations that Social Security is going to be out there for everyone going forward. And the fact of the matter is that it will. The problem is that we do not have the monies, the funds lined up to do what? To pay the amount that we have kind of agreed to pay, we being the government, right? Anyhow, that's really what this is. It becomes a math problem. So there are two ways you can kind of address this, three ways. One would be, this is all government failure. One would be to reduce the benefits, the benefits that are being paid out. So reduce those benefits. Secondly, would be to increase taxes, and that's certainly a no-go. Increasing the taxes. The third would be to grow the economy and try to restructure some of this, to alter the who is eligible to receive these different benefits, the ages for receiving, Social Security and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of different ways through this, but it's very, very daunting, and this is certainly another indication of government failure. The outcome is $123.11 trillion shortfall, which breaks down to a burden of about $800,000 per federal taxpayer. And frankly, that number is probably up closer to $900,000 per federal taxpayer. So this is just the inflows and outflows so far as like an income statement is concerned. So the revenue that was received, and this would be at the federal level, was about $3.6 trillion. Total expenses amounted to $7.4 trillion. This was in 2021. And so there was this kind of drives us toward that deficit, if you will. But there are other things that are driving this as well. Other commitments that are made that may not have been delivered as of yet. So other changes in that position include increases in Social Security and Medicare liabilities. It's moving the bar. It's expanding the payments without expanding the revenue that's associated with those expenses. So here we are. So this was the update for 2022. Okay. So the conditions worsened from 2021 by $10 trillion. So we tacked on another $10 trillion. This year's report shows that the U.S. government's financial condition worsened by more than $10 trillion in 2021. The United States needs $133 trillion to pay its bills. The majority of this debt can be attributed to Medicare and Social Security. These are promises that have been made to our citizens, but the government has not set any money aside to fund them, or not enough money set aside to fund them. Other contributing factors include military and civilian retirement benefits, publicly held debt, which is over $30 trillion now, by the way, and other liabilities. So again, this is a rather stark picture of where we're at, and this is certainly, to wrap things up, this is certainly government failure in action, right?